Hello and welcome to another episode of Rethinking Education, Education's Critical Friend. My name is James Mannion.
And my name's David Cameron.
And you are very welcome. It is nice to be with you. It's funny, I was just thinking earlier, we were talking just now about AI, and David often, you introduce yourself as the real David Cameron. But how do we know this? How do we know that this is not just some deep fake? Like, I'm seeing deep fake videos absolutely everywhere. Like, you could just be like some digital, I don't know, what, an avatar.
Yeah, it's truly disturbing prospect, although why anyone would want two of me remains a mystery. I always remember when I started as a director of children's services, my secretary said to me, you need to remember something. Every time you open your mouth, the director speaks. And I tried to be more director-like. And I went on to eBay, tried to buy Gravitas, all of that kind of stuff. And it really didn't work for me. I became like a deep fake director, like a real walking deep fake director. And then I went on some kind of conference and I was told to bring my personality to work. And, and I decided I would do that. And I said to the management team, I said, look, guys, I've been trying so hard to be somebody I'm not, and now I'm going to bring my personality to work. And my head of education said, that's fine, David, just not all of it.
It's very interesting that, isn't it? That makes me think back to my early days as a teacher when I was sort of, that whole like philosophy that people often say, like, don't smile till Christmas.
Yeah.
Don't sort of try to be their friend, right? You're not their friend, you're their science teacher, and sort of, yeah, leave a lot of you behind. And I sort of just thought that I was performing this like quite robotic, performance of a science teacher who's just sort of I don't know, I think robotic goes some way to capturing it. Who's just sort of like not particularly. I remember just feeling like I wasn't able to respond or to be very alive, and I remember just sort of going and visiting some of the other teachers who the kids. I sort of said to the kids, like, who do you like being taught by? And I went and saw them, and they just like told stories, and they were really relaxed. And it took me a long time to realize this, but actually being yourself and being, even if you've got quite a weird personality like me, like just actually having some personality, it just gives them something to grab a hold of. And there's something in that. I think that don't smile till Christmas is terrible advice.
Yeah, and I do think that often the people giving it never smile anyway. So there's that classic thing of, don't you smile till Christmas, because I'll never smile, because I'm actually miserable and I don't really like children all that much. And there's something very Govian about that whole idea that the job of the teacher is to transmit, and that whole language that we've developed currently about delivery, um, and you're passing on the best that's been thought and taught and all of that stuff that we've
Mm,
talked about before. But as a result of that, the last thing you want is a teacher who's a functioning being. You want somebody who's programmed and robotic. They know what they need to pass on. They've read all the appropriate American research. They've got that whole background. And there's a brilliant piece out just now by Sam Gibbs who talks about this whole kind of contraction of teaching and the removal of creativity. And it's almost like it's like what Starmer's currently doing with the right. Um, we're so threatened by AI, we're actually becoming it before it takes us over.
right.
Um, there's some interesting thoughts around that.
Yeah. Yeah. We haven't got our heads around that at all, have we? Like, as far as I can gather, people who work in AI, I approached this guy recently, who is one of the people who's the most forward-thinking, I think, person who writes about AI and works in it. A guy called Nabil Qureshi, and I invited him onto the pod, and he basically said, like, thanks for the invitation, but I've not really thought that much about the implications for education yet. And so the AI guys aren't really thinking about that. And in education, I've seen a few people talking about AI at conferences, but it's always just like we are at the absolute baby steps of getting our heads around this. And you can very easily imagine, like, the EEF publishes a randomized control trial, let's say in 2027, where they've compared an AI tutor versus human teachers, and the AI outperformed, and the kids get much better results with the AI. Like, you can just see that happening, can't you? That's coming down the track at some point. I don't see why teaching should be as far as that robotic part that you were just talking about, the actual, like, the mechanical shifting information from a curriculum into a kid's head, and tailoring, having sort of bespoke feedback loops where you can sort of identify what their areas for development are and give them targeted worked examples and all of that. And obviously there are lots of elements of teaching that are not about the robotic relaying of information. But I don't really see many people engaging with this in a very serious way, myself included. Like, I'm not in any way suggesting that I'm ahead of the curve here. I think we're sort of just blindly bumbling into this. I mean, it's not even the future, is it? It's already happening. And I don't really see many people talking much sense about this.
Yeah, there's an interesting discussion going on just now about the open school and the idea of a kind of open university equivalent, if you like, for schools. And it's more than that. I'm not doing a good service to the idea. But one of the things that I'm profoundly interested in around it is that we are in a position where so much can be done through AI or through individualized technology, which, if we go down that road entirely, just further atomizes the society we're in. And we're already facing the consequences of that. I think you and I have probably discussed Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, about the damage that's been done through social media, through access to smartphones. And schools have an incredibly valuable role in terms of the creation of community and a sense of belonging and a sense of mutuality. And all of these things are essential elements. And maybe what we need to think about in terms of AI is how we let that, that drone, that repetitive work of schooling get done in other ways and allow us to focus on that creation of commonality, of mutuality, of creativity, and genuinely making children, helping children rather, to become better people rather than simply people with very, very, very good GCSEs.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And there's something that I've been thinking about recently, which is about, like, I recently wrote this post about the educational polycrisis, right? Which
Yes.
is the fact that we've got all of these multiple crises piling up. One of them that I didn't mention in that post is the SEND crisis, which we're gonna touch upon today. But there are lots of issues, right? Attendance, teacher retention, pupil disengagement, pupil behavior, and so on. And one thing that I think would be a really easy thing to implement, this is going to be the focus of my next blog, is to just is to just have one lesson a week, which is called something like making sense, right? And this is like, you could do this right the way through school, from primary through to like age 18. And it's very similar to, I don't know if you've ever worked with philosophy for children as an approach. It's
I'm aware of it.
You're aware of it. It's an amazing thing. I sort of stumbled into it very early in my career. It's an amazing pedagogy, hated by traditionalists, because it's not clear what the goal is. It's not about passing exams. It's not about, like, teaching information. It's really not. You actually have to sit on your hands. And I remember I sort of got pulled up for it when I was training as a facilitator of philosophical inquiry lessons. And we were having a discussion about the universe, about parallel universes, and the kids were sort of confused about the difference between the idea of a parallel universe and there just being life on other planets within this universe. And I was like, oh, it's okay, kids, I can explain this. And I just killed the conversation. Like that was not the place. We're not. It's not, cramming for a test on universes and parallel universes. It was just an exploration of space and meaning and what it is to be human in this infinite void and all of that. And so it's not to everybody's taste, but I really, really love it. It's a circle time session. So you just get in a circle, you chuck the tables to the side of the room so there's nothing in between you. You sit in a circle. And sometimes it can be quite teacher led, where the teacher sort of says, right, here's a stimulus, here's a poem, here's a piece of art. We're going to talk about the big ideas behind this. But I found the most interesting lessons were just completely open ended. And I say, right, what's on your mind? What big questions are you carrying around? And we would do a little bit of work to prepare them about, like what kinds of questions lend themselves to an extended discussion, and they get pretty good at asking those kinds of questions very quickly. But just to have a regular time in the week where every kid can take part and they don't have to speak in those lessons if they don't want, they can just sit and listen. And that's fine. Or you can do little turn and talks so that they can just talk to their partner. But not everybody wants to be, be in the crucible of a whole class discussion. But just to have conversations about things like technology use, right? To talk about things like AI and some news article that's just cropped up about it, or about the way in which, the extent to which they use their phones and how, how difficult it is to live with this technology, or, things like we were talking with Lewis Wedlock about adolescence and misogyny, right? And these things sort of crop up from time to time, and just to check in with that and just to talk about that, to talk about, that Supreme Court ruling recently about the definition of a woman and what have you, like just making sense of the world, just having some
Yeah.
time in the curriculum where we're not assessing it, we're not necessarily planning it, but we're just having like human connection time, right? And just like that would be such a quick win, I think, because kids would really look forward to those lessons. They used to absolutely love those philosophical inquiry lessons. Teachers don't have to plan it, they don't have to mark it. That's an easy win-win. And it just feels like that's what's missing, I think, especially in secondary education, because the kids are sort of pinballing from lesson to lesson to lesson to lesson, and all those teachers are under pressure to cover a huge amount of curriculum in a very finite time. And so all of that time gets squeezed out. And I think that having some sort of one lesson a week to call it something like making sense, that feels to me like it would be a really easy thing to implement. And it would just be like releasing a pressure valve, and it'd just be like, oh, here's just a little bit of time and space where we don't have to plan, we don't have to assess, we can just speak and listen and understand each other a little bit more.
Yeah, I think two things on that. I think one is there's a marvelous scene in Adolescence, which I've now watched,
Oh, right.
um, where the policeman who's investigating the case is in the school, and it's the school that his son attends. And at one point, his son asks to speak to him, and they have this conversation where the son tells him that he's embarrassing himself. And his son then decodes for him the Instagram discussion
That's
that
right.
Jamie, the main character, has been part of.
Yeah.
And he is translating a language that his father not only does not understand, but wasn't even aware existed.
Yeah.
And there's no place within the system as it's conceived, particularly in England, for young people to be able to enlighten us or open up their world to us.
Right.
There's no place for listening, and I think that's hugely important. And the other thing which it ties into it is I keep talking to people about the importance of the non-binary question. And people are intimidated by a question to which there's a right answer and a wrong answer, or they can be intimidated by that. And the question to which there's no answer, um, the question that I use, what is beauty, allows people to explore what they think rather than try and give you back the answer that you've already decided is correct.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I think what we've managed to do though, James, is quite remarkable. We've managed to stumble into the conversation we usually have to provoke by asking each other what we've done in the last week, which is great because I've done nothing of any significance in the last week. So this is a blessing. Thank you for that.
Well, you're very welcome. I wish I could say the same. My last week has been absolutely insane because I'm just going to take that as your way of asking me about my week, and I'm going to shoehorn into this conversation the fact that I've been doing this show in the Brighton Fringe, a rock musical, which I which I have written. It's my third one. We did the first one 10 years ago, and this one is actually like a reworking of that first one. And it's called The Angel of Death Will See You Now. And we're doing 8 shows throughout the month, and it's a full-on thing. There's like 6 of us in the band, and 3 of us are acting as well as singing. And there's a 10-piece choir, this all-female choir. And it's in this big church with an amazing acoustic. We've got this absolutely fantastic sound engineer and lighting guy. So it's like it's a big production. It's a very full-on thing to do. And on Saturday we did 2 shows, a matinee and an evening one, and then and also with a gig in the middle, like a promo gig in the little tent city thing, and another one on Sunday night, which is all a bit much if I'm honest. And like my feet are sort of barely touching the ground, and it's honestly, man, it is the favorite thing that I do of all of the things that I do. I absolutely love my work in education. But the thing about because as I went freelance in 2020 in the first lockdown, I stopped working at UCL and went freelance. And I really like everything about my work, apart from the fact that I spend so much time in this room with my beautiful Labrador, who has many qualities, but conversation is not one of them. And just like community and all of these people, oh my goodness, they're so lovely and they're so talented, and they're also like just giving up. All everyone's doing it for love. Like there's no money in it. It's losing money. It's not about that. But it's just community, and it's all it was really making me laugh because another thing that's so sort of hated by the sort of arch traditionalists is like all that stuff that people talk about under the banner of like 21st century skills. Like it's creativity, it's absolutely creativity, it's figuring out, it's problem solving, it's figuring out problems that you have about people misunderstanding cues, or the lighting rig isn't working, or how do you market something. It's communication, right? It's all about that. It's about collaboration. It's about putting your heads together and figuring stuff out. And that is where just the juice is of life. Like it's absolutely the best fun that I could have. And it absolutely ties back to education, not least because I play a teacher called James, which is
Ah,
basically, as you can see, not too much of a stretch to see where I got the inspiration from that from. So yeah, it's really interesting. I absolutely adore it.
I'm so pleased that you spoke about that because I've been waiting to hear about it for ages. And because you're doing it in Bristol, I think,
Brighton.
Brighton, sorry, then obviously it's kind of out of my orbit unless I get some work down there. So I'm delighted to hear about that. And I'll just use this to give a huge shout out to a friend of mine, really good friend, Pete Clark, whose funeral I attended um, just a couple of weeks back. And Pete was a muso. He would play with anyone. He played solo piano in a hotel, in the style of the Baker Boys. Um, he was asked what he played. He said it's sometimes shite in D and other times shite in F. Um, but he would stand in with bands. He had his own band, all of that. And he finished up playing in a Springsteen session band. But one of the things that Pete did was he organized all these events, concerts, musical tours in the school that he taught in. And the impact that that had on the young people who were involved was exactly an echo of the kind of thing that you're talking about. It's that sense of togetherness, that sense of coping, that sense of meeting challenge, all of that. And the things that his students took away from that were far more varied and I think far richer than many of the things that they would take away from his classroom. And he was a good teacher. So wherever Pete is now, a big shout out to him as one of the good guys who gave so much more than just passing on the best that we know and the best that's been thought and the best that's been done. He passed on the best that you can do, the best that you can know, and the best that you might become. And I guess that's pretty good summary of a lot of the conversation we've just been having.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. He sounds like an amazing guy. I wish I had known him.
And he was. You would have liked him.
Yeah, I'm sure I would. Okay, so shall we talk about today's guest a little? This is going to be my first time. I've known of Amjad's work for a long time, but I've never met him or spoken to him before today. So I'm very much looking forward to that. But you guys go back a little way.
We do indeed.
Carry on talking. I've got to get shoo a fly out of the room, or it's going to
right.
be.
Um, I kind of had various connections with Amjad over the years, and I'm a really big fan of his. I love the practicality of his work. I love his enthusiasm. You've got a Labrador in the house, shares many of Amjad's qualities. Um, but I also love the fact that Amjad's always kept one foot in schools. He was up until recently he worked 4 days a week. He talks a lot in both in general conversation and in the work that he does about what happens in schools. He's really fresh in that regard. I admire the way that he's maintained that commitment. And he's so practical and so helpful in that regard. His Try This Teaching a website is really worth it. And he's a kind of, he's a great place to go if you just need something, an idea, a thought, whatever. Amjad's site's very good for that. And it's free. He puts an enormous amount into the system. I've had him up here. He's stayed in the house with us a couple of times. Um, and I think he regards it as some weird Scottish baronial mansion, uh, just because I happen to have a log fire. Um, all of that stuff. But he's got a real genuine enthusiasm. I think he's great fun. I think he makes a real and significant contribution, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about his book, which will be one of the centerpieces of what we talk about today.
Well, without further ado, let's hand over to our fascinating conversation with Amjad Ali. Hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Amjad Ali, welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you, James. Thank you, David.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, it really is. Like I've been wanting to meet you for many years. I've been aware of your work and an admirer from afar. Excuse me. And I know that you and David go back a long time, and so this is why I've not given David the introduction rights. And so just for the benefit of our listeners and myself, could you just give us like a sort of a potted background as to like the work that you do and how you came to do the work that you do currently?
Sure. So thank you for having me again. I've been teaching, this will be the end of my 19th year. So I finished my law degree and spent 1 year post-degree working as a learning support assistant or teaching assistant in various young offender institutes. And then I went immediately into doing a graduate teacher program into my former secondary school. So I went back to my old secondary school and went in. Um, Almost instantly, in relation to kind of leadership positions, around 5 years or so into teaching, I become an advanced skills teacher
Mm.
in teaching and learning. But those days it was called learning and teaching to be slightly cool. Um, Learning and
I
teaching.
remember those heady days.
Yeah. But I got a kind of unique role of learning and teaching advanced skills teacher, whereas other ASTs were subject specific. So
Right.
I went, no, I don't want to go subject specific. I want the kind of element of pedagogy and the teaching and learning element. And so at those times, the current government used to fund local authorities. Local authorities used to fund schools to buy you out for a day a week. So 14 odd years ago, I was bought out from my school one day a week. So my one day a week journey started then around 14 years ago. And when the new government come in, the Conservatives, they scrapped the AST program, they scrapped the fast track program, everything that I was in on, they just scrapped, and I was like, oh, I don't know what I'm gonna do. And then lots of schools that I'd previously delivered to during my one day a week for the local authority were getting in touch, and they were saying, Amjad, can you come deliver some more training? And I was like, I don't know, can I? And they were like, yeah, just come as yourself. And I was like, how do we do this? Like, who do you pay? How does it work? And they were like, listen, we'll sort it out. And then it just kind of grew from there. And I've always worked. I've had a very, I would say, probably very, very rare career in the sense of I've been point 0.8 alongside significant leadership responsibilities and delivering CPD for at least one day a week for around 10 years. So I'm old enough now to say to people, listen, I've been doing this a while now. I've been doing this, and I've met David a long time ago. And David, I toyed with when I got greedy. I think I'll use the word greedy. I toyed with the idea of just ditching teaching and then just going into consultancy. And David was always a sensible ear, saying, listen, and talk to me about the USP of being in a school and then delivering alongside that. And my role now has grown to, I now work for the Chiltern Learning Trust. I'm the trust training and inclusion lead, so I'm still involved in schools and school improvement, and I still work for myself too. So interesting in the sense of it's probably rare for a classroom teacher and someone that's taught continuously to deliver CPD at least one day a week for around 10 years. So that's kind of a bit about me.
Yeah, and I've always admired that about you. I was saying to James before you came on that one of the things I love about talking to you is you've still got all these fresh anecdotes and these fresh stories, and you've got that ability to talk about young people that loads of people have lost. There are loads of people on the scene who are telling other people's stories, but you're still telling your own. And I think there's something really important about that in terms of credibility and trust as well.
Yeah, and I mean, my first leadership role was in inclusion, and as an assistant head, I didn't need to do this NAE-SENCO qualification, so the SENCO qualification. I didn't need to do it, but in my head, I was thinking, if I'm line managing SENCOs and inclusion leads, how can I do that if I don't know what their role is? So I become qualified in SEND. I become a qualified SENCO 10 years ago, alongside becoming an assistant head, alongside doing this part-time. But yeah, one of the things that drove me for CPD especially is I've sat through diabolical CPD a lot. And what I need to make sure that I don't do to my audiences are the things that I hated. And one of the things that I hated was when people would come up to you and talk to you directly about teaching and classroom-based pedagogy, having not done it for a long time. And I'm like, well, how are you telling me this? So I tried to make sure that I don't do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really interesting. And so you mentioned being a SENCO there, and I think that I want to come back to that. We would very much like to discuss your work in that area and your brilliant book, A Little Guide for Teachers, SEND in Schools. But just quickly, before we do that, I know you've also done lots of work around being a strong voice in BAME education and advocating for greater representation and equality. Could you just give us a flavour of the work that you've been doing there and of where you think we are in achieving the ambitions that you have, perhaps as yourself or as an organisation?
Yeah, so again, and David's been alongside this journey, having invited BayMed up for one of the creative conversations that he organizes in Edinburgh. We've been doing this a long time as well. So we started off as a grassroots movement following the amazing footsteps of Woman Ed, and we created BayMed, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic Educators, to look at the systematic and systemic underrepresentation of leadership positions of people in ethnic minority groups. Not necessarily people of color, but people in ethnic minority groups. So we're talking about Romani Gypsy as well. We're talking about Chinese. We're talking about people that are underrepresented in leadership groups. We build up this kind of grassroots movement, putting on an annual conference for free, getting sponsorship, and doing our usual kind of connections and building up a network. We've now expanded as a national charity. We've got regional hubs. We've got a BayMed Scotland. We've got BayMed Wales. We've got lots of hubs. But essentially, something that we do, and a lot of people don't realize, or a lot of people that aren't, we ironically, contrary to my own work, we don't sing and shout about what we're doing with BayMed. We just quietly crack on. We're doing the work. We're training up leadership coaches. We put on support networks. We do a lot of stuff in the background for BayMed, and yeah, we're really proud of what we've achieved. And one of the things that, unless you've been involved in a charity, you don't realize how much work it is. And we're volunteers. We do this alongside our other jobs. So we've been working hard on that. But we're still, to make a really blunt statement, no further forward in anything really. ITT applications for people with ethnic minority groups is lower than non-ethnic minority groups. Chances of promotion is significantly reduced for ethnic groups the higher up you get. So we don't want to put out more and more research. Like David will remember research, and you'll remember research from years ago. The Lamb Inquiry was 1984 when I was born, so 41 years ago. Yet the same cycles of reports are coming out. So we're just trying to chip away and trying to help people in realizing their potential and not being scuppered by the color of your skin or your religion that you belong to.
I think that's hugely impressive as well, Amjad, because that's, that kind of, in a sense, just broadens your circle all the time. And rumor has it you still find time to be quite a good dad.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the dad thing. I'll never forget when I had my eldest. He went all over social media. I told everyone. I was like, "Listen, here's my firstborn." Da, 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 da. And I remember Jazz. You know Jazz, David.
Yeah.
Jazz once at a conference. Jazz Ampalfour, who's probably the best speaker in the country, probably the world. We were both speaking at the same event, and she said, "Oh, and after me will be Amjad, who apparently is the first dad in the world." And I was like, "Listen, I am. This is the first time I've been a dad, and I now got 3 children. I got 3 boys. But if you don't know me personally or privately, you wouldn't know that. You would only still know that I've only got Zach, who's my eldest. And the reason why I got totally banned from my wife, she was like, it's too late for the first one, but the other 2 are not going on social media. You're not plus. I was like, all right, sorry. But yeah, that to me is the heart of what I do and how I do it and why I do it. Is for my kids, is for the family. Yeah, that's really important to me.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important part of the conversation, because I think one of the qualities that you have, because you're so good as a presenter and you exude such confidence and all of that, I think people often miss the complexity and the humanity around that. So I thought we'd just give you the opportunity to show us a little bit of that. And now we'll start plugging your book.
Yeah,
Okay,
no
then.
problem, no problem.
So SEND, like I was talking about this with David off air, and so like I wrote a blog recently, which I called it confronting the educational polycrisis, right? So like this word polycrisis, you sometimes hear people talk about it in the wider sense, like the global, the interplay between wars in Ukraine, for example, and the cost of living crisis, cost of energy, climate change, and right, the way that all of the economic turmoil, the way that all of these very complicated systems sort of interact and intersect and become entangled. And I sort of just zoomed in on education, and I picked out 7 in that blog about like the attendance crisis, like escalating, challenging behavior, teacher recruitment, teacher retention, and so on and so on. And SEND I didn't include in that list. Not particularly. It wasn't intended to be a comprehensive list. I just sort of picked 7. But I wonder whether you agree, like, with that language about, like, if you think about the state of SEND, and we could maybe get into some of the challenges that we face, do you feel like it is in crisis? Do you feel, because there are two types of crisis, right? Aren't there? There's like a sudden crisis that comes out of nowhere, like a humanitarian crisis because of an earthquake or something. And then there's just like in a situation that's just sort of getting gradually worse in a creeping way until you get to the point where you're like, actually, my goodness, we're overwhelmed here, and we're at crisis point, as it were. So, like, what do you think about that framing? Do you agree that there's an SEND crisis? And if so, how would you describe that?
I mean, to continue your analogy of like a natural disaster, I think a crisis can only be defined by something unexpected. And so therefore, say for example, we were sailing on a ship and the ship suddenly hits a rock, and that becomes a crisis because we're not prepared for the rock hitting the ship. Yes, we've got some life jackets, yes, we've got some lifeboats, but we're not fully prepared for the unexpected. The SEND situation has not been unexpected. This has been clear, it's been obvious, it's been argued, shouted, pushed towards the government, towards local authorities for many a year. And so now the best way to describe it is we're on that ship and we're slowly floating away from land. And we could see land, yet we're going further and further away from land. And then we're calling it a crisis, yet despite us paddling away from land. So we need to think very hard about where we are with this and what we're doing. What I would say, though, the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, is lots of schools want to do something about this. And a lot of schools are saying, right, we know there's an issue, but what do we do? And we've kind of gone, it's kind of gone full circle with, say, for example, anti-racism. So anti-racism was up there for a little while, and SEND was down here. And now it's kind of flipped over. So now it's like, don't worry about that equality stuff. We don't need to worry about that. We need to be equitable in the classroom through SEND, and at least we're ticking one equity box. So yeah, I think the SEND situation is vast. There's numerous debates and podcasts and video clips about whether there's an overdiagnosis situation going on. I hear there's Parliament mooting around the idea whether it should even be on the NHS. I think in Scotland they've decided something along the lines of maybe ADHD and autism should not be an NHS diagnosis and it should move to private. But yeah, I think the main system that I think we're missing with SEND is the simplicity of the mechanics of teaching. We've been teaching teachers to teach too much to the middle/top. And therefore, this has become a crisis when we realize not everyone is average and not everyone is able and not everyone is optimal in what their approach to learning is. And therefore, it's exasperated in that way.
And does the book help with that? I mean, I think what you've just said, Amjad, is really interesting and profound, which is that it's not a crisis that's focused. If it is a crisis, it's not one that's focused on the young people who have a diagnosis or an identified condition. It's an issue about pedagogy not catering broadly enough, rather than the way a lot of people would see it as pedagogy not not responding specifically enough. There's something really interesting, and tell us a bit about how your book helps with that.
So I wrote a book. Just I've got a copy of it here somewhere. Yeah, I have one sec. I need to show you this because I wrote a book as part of the Little Guide for Teachers series, right? And it's a little book, literally this big. And we had to consciously make a little book. Otherwise, I'm confident that people wouldn't have bought it. And that's the state of kind of the complexities of SEND. Whereas teachers will be, yes, I know that I should be learning about that, but that's just too much information, and I'm not sure how I could do that. And David's been fortunate/unfortunate to hear me speak lots and lots of times. I deliver in a very conversational tone and a very, what I would say, personable tone. So I wrote the book in exactly that way. The first chapter, just to prove to everyone I could write, I wrote formally and said, look, here you go. Here's your first chapter. It's formal, in formal standard English, just so you know that I'm an English teacher, but I'm reverting to conversational tone straight away after this. And I start by saying to everyone that we used to say kids were uneducable, and that was permitted and that was permissible. Then we moved to what about the other 29 kids, which was basically your way of saying some kids are uneducable. And now we've moved to a point where we're going, oh, but I can't create bespoke individual lessons for every single child. Yeah, nobody's asking you to. So the main crux of my book is to provide people with low effort, high impact, tried and tested strategies that are needed for some but benefit all. And that's hard because what you got to do is think, actually, I don't want neurodivergent children to fit into non-neurodivergent spaces, i.e. neurotypical spaces. What I want is for us neurotypical people, so me, I'm not knowing your own situations, to be able to fit into neurodivergent spaces. And so we're flipping the system and saying, here's what to do for them that will actually benefit all of us, as opposed to here's what you do for everyone else, and then here's what you do for them on top. So I use a phrase whenever I deliver a whole school CPD. I'm not here to give you additional ideas. I'm here to give you instead of ideas. And that's basically what the book's full of.
And it also fits with your website. Try this, try this
Yeah.
instead. And
Yeah.
so could you give us a few practical examples of what these sorts of strategies are that work for SEND kids and everyone?
Yes, absolutely. So, for example, you don't have to be diagnosed with ADHD to understand that nobody wants to sit 60 minutes non-stop still listening to someone speak. So you don't need to have a diagnosis of ADHD to realize that children and adults need natural movement breaks. So you could integrate natural learning breaks into your lesson. So it might be as simple as the students come into the class, you give them all a sticker. The sticker has half a word, half a date, half a quote, half an equation, half of anything on it. In the middle of a lesson, when you need to integrate a natural movement break, you say, right, everybody stand up, go and find your other half. They simply get up, they look around the room, they find the rest of their date, quote, formula, keyword, whatever. They join up with each other, they tell each other what the words are, we hear them out, and then we go and sit down and we get a natural movement break. Another example might be simply we say, right, everybody stand up, I'm going to ask a question, quick fire questions. Last one to sit down has to answer the questions. So I just fire out 5 questions, natural movement break, needed for some explicitly, but everybody benefits. Everyone's like, yeah, you know what? I needed that. I do that in the whole school CPD. I say, right, you can now get up and go to another table and borrow an idea. And I know for a fact that there are at least one people on each table that need to get up. So they're like, yeah, I'll go. And they get up, they walk around, they give themselves a little bit of a shake off. They go and talk to the other table quickly. They come and sit down and they're refocused. Another kind of really simple one that everybody, when I say it, is like, oh yeah, obviously, is you don't have to be dyslexic to want legible, organized slides. But if you were not dyslexic, we can cope with illegible, chaotic slides. So it's needed for some, but actually benefit all. You don't have to be autistic to not want sensory overload and chaos in a classroom. But if you're not autistic, you'll just go, that was terrible, and you could cope with it, but it won't be the end of the world for you, but we won't like it. So all of those strategies that are explicit for those children actually benefit us too.
Thank you. That's very rich and nice handful of. It reminds me of I was once working in a school running practitioner inquiry programs, and the person who worked in reprographics would like asked if they could take part in this program that was just for teachers, because they were just like despairing at the worksheets that are going through their machines, and they were like, stuff that's being photocopied goodness knows how many times removed from the original, and tiny little font. And they sort of did this really interesting study where they were like, what type of font, what type of life spacing, column width is really good, so your eye doesn't have to track across the whole page, but you can just read in columns. And they established this lovely little protocol. It's just like, if you're making a worksheet, here's a template that you can follow. Like you say, it works for everyone, and it just makes everybody's life easier. But it's one of those things that, you know, doesn't always cross your mind, does it? Until you've heard that example of the sticker, for example. Like you say, you know, I think that you said a really smart thing earlier. Where you sort of said we're taught to teach to the middle, to the high end, and stretch and challenge is always the language, isn't it? How can we stretch and challenge people? But like, so having a more inclusive palette, essentially, a more inclusive repertoire of
and we have to acknowledge that being more inclusive became synonymous with lowering quality or lowering output. And that's absolutely not what we're here for.
Like differentiating down, like sort of
Absolutely.
oversimplifying things, you mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
There's something interesting in there, Amjad, because lots of the people listening to this won't be teachers.
Mhm.
And there'll be lots of them, particularly, that'll just be parents or concerned citizens. Are there any messages for them about, what they can do right now to help us deal with, what clearly is an issue, if not a crisis?
Absolutely. Interestingly, my books for parents, probably not children. However, a couple of Amazon reviews are from kids that have read them from their parents. So one of my favorite reviews is from a year 5 or year 6 child that said, "I read your book and I've given it to my teacher. I think every teacher should read your book." And Zaki, actually, interestingly, I don't know how many he's passed out, but he was taking a book and giving them to all of his teachers at school. And I was like, "Zaki, they cost money. You can't just hand them out." He went, "But you've got a pile. I just thought it's okay. I'll give one to Miss Redding. I'll give one to Miss Rutter." And when I went in for parents even, they were like, "Thanks so much for the books." And I was like, "How many did you guys get?" He just was like loading them up. But for parents, I've delivered training for example, for looked after schools, for foster carers that are taking on children that have come with a lot of additional needs and emotional needs. And essentially, what I would say is that, and this statement is really important, there's more that connects our learning than differentiates us. And so, irrespective of your need, irrespective of your issue, irrespective of your condition, there's more that connects how we learn than actually what needs to be separated. And sometimes I think when a parent has got their boxing gloves on because they've had to put them on and they've had to put them on because they've had so many punches to the face themselves, they've started to say, "What else will you do? What different thing will you do? How much more can you support?" And actually, what we need to do is strip it down to, how can I be included at the base level to do what everyone else is doing? And one of the things that I would advise is we need to look at the simple mechanics of learning. And there's so many things out there. There's so many, like, rich concepts out there. One of the things, having a child now, 7-year-old, 5-year-old, and nearly 3-year-old, is I've been watching him go through reception through year 1, and he's now in year 2. And my biggest gap is maths in primary. Can't do it. No idea. Absolutely no idea how to support him with that. English, I could help. I even learned phonics program to do with that. But parents, we need to upskill ourselves as well. And if you're not able to, then we need to talk to the school in how do we get involved in what the other children are doing rather than what I think a lot of parents do naturally. What else can you provide my child? And that's something maybe for another discussion.
It's a pretty good contribution to this discussion, Amjad. I mean, I think there's something really powerful, as there often is with you, about the shorthand. Ask what can be done, not what else can be done,
Mhm.
is a really powerful strapline in a discussion with parents, because, as you say, our focus will tend to be on our child. And that idea of let's lift our heads up and look at what we're doing across the board. I think there's a really important message there that cuts right across. And thanks for giving it to us.
Pleasure.
Thank you. So let's zoom out a little bit. That's really helpful to give us a sense as to the work that you're doing and sort of at the teacher training end. Let's zoom back out to that metaphor that you had, that we're on this ship that's ever further adrift. So there are a number of dimensions to this, aren't there? Like funding is probably the number one thing, right? That people just say, like, there's not enough funding. There are delays in assessments and there's delays in support. Parents have often they often use the language of fighting for their child. They often
and I use the analogy of boxing glove to link to that. So that happens, yeah.
Can you explain the boxing glove thing?
Yeah, so the fight is real because a lot of parents will say, I've had to fight for my child and I've had to fight for the support. And whilst fundamentally any rational parent or carer will go, whilst I understand that you don't have the funding, what I don't accept is that this is okay. And the funding issue is massive. But I mean, I feel like we've kind of gone full circle. So when I first become an assistant head in inclusion around 10 years ago, I set up an alternative provision unit within the school. We have learning mentors, academic mentors. We had adapted curricula. We had kind of bespoke spaces for these students, smaller classes, etc. And then as the funding depleted, we had to basically scrap all of those things. And then we've hit now what we would argue as a crisis point, and everyone's saying we need those things back. But yet the funding has then dropped again. And so I don't know. Is it as simple as making the right choice for your school? Is it as simple as saying what's needed and how can we make it happen? Because what we can't do is just simply say we can't do it. And whilst we need to put pressure on local authorities, put pressure on our kind of systems, it fascinates me how some schools have absolutely brilliant setups and some schools don't. And the variance in it is interesting in itself.
Yeah, I think that was going to be my next point,
Mm.
about like inconsistencies in provision. There's like this massive sort of, I guess, what you might call a postcode lottery or some sort of, yeah, just a very patchy network of provision, and like increasing the consistency of high quality provision. We know what good looks like, but it's just not happening everywhere, which is really interesting because that's like lots of the work that I do is around implementation science and improvement science. And implementation science is basically where you have something that you know works, you know what good looks like, but it's just not happening in a routine way across the system. How can we achieve that? We could perhaps come back to implementation later. And then there's a few other sort of dimensions to it. There's like exclusions and off-rolling, and kids with SEND are disproportionately excluded and off-rolled. There's the strain on families and the stress that comes with it, with having to navigate this system which is, there are people like Naomi Fisher and Eliza Fricker has written some really good books about like the parents' experience of just having all of these meetings with all of this like super heavy jargon and all these acronyms, and it's like this impenetrable bureaucratic sort of swamp that you find yourself in the middle of. And there's also the intersection of SEND and disadvantage, right? Which is another thing. And then there's the question that you raised about around diagnosis earlier, and whether we're sort of being a bit too quick to diagnose people who are just sort of varying in ways that are actually fairly normal, right? Like this is sort of normal degree of variance.
I mean, I wouldn't have an opinion at all on whether we're over or under diagnosing. What I would have an opinion on, and I would say when I first wrote my book, it was at the time the only book SEND related that had a chapter on race and SEND overlap. So the
Okay.
intersectionality link between under and over representation of certain SEND characteristics with racial associations. And so as what I would do in all my work, rather than just saying, here's a problem, I set out a template for an action plan for people to use to then look at their own SEND registers and see, have you got an under or over representation? For example, some ethnic minority groups, if struggling, will get told there must be an underlying lead. Some ethnic minority groups get told you're a problem, you need to get excluded. So it's that addressing that kind of issue. But what I think is really important with the kind of SEND and the parents dichotomy is, I don't know how this has happened, but we've now been pitched against each other. And it's almost like parents are told that the schools aren't doing it, and the schools are told that the parents aren't supporting. And we've been left fighting with each other, whilst, as always, the system isn't providing for both of us. And so we've been left with this situation. And so those examples of people that you gave on Twitter, it's just a fight. They'll say something and everyone will go, no, 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 that's not it. And it's just like, why are we arguing with each other? We're looking at the same route, the same situation, the same issue for our students. We want the best for them, but we've been left pitching against each other, which is problematic.
Yeah, and the diagnosis thing has become very much part of that, I think. I mean, certainly when I was a head of education or a director, the lots of parents wanted to get a diagnosis because it gave them more power, they felt.
Mhm.
And it linked them into organizations. It did all sorts of things for them. And it became an argument that was hard to refuse. So they wanted their kids classified and identified as different in order that they could then be included and treated properly. And a huge
And
irony.
yeah, and unfortunately, that's true in some places. I mean, I've got a friend that I actually used to go to secondary school with, who's now got 5 children, and we see each other on Saturday mornings where we're taking our kids swimming, and he's taking his kids swimming. He has 5. I don't know how he does it. And then at football, and he's told me about his younger child who's now got an EHCP. And I said, "How's he doing?" In fact, it was just this Sunday. I said, "How's he doing?" He said, "Great." And I said to him, "How did that piece of paper change how he's doing?" And he said he got more support. And I said, "So was it that piece of paper that enabled that more support?" He said, "Yes." That's then pitches me in a problematic situation when I've sat with parents and I've said, "Look, despite that piece of paper that your child may or may not get, I cannot offer any more support." And it might not be believable, but then when that paper has been received, I say, "I still have nothing else to give you because I was giving you everything as if you have that piece of paper anyway." And so that's where some schools are, and that's where it creates more of a divide.
Yeah, yeah. So it's quite a tangled web, isn't it? Like that, all of those very complex, interconnected, intersecting issues. And so I'm going to throw a really hard question at you, which is like, let's say that you were installed as the like SEND czar, for want of a better phrase, right? As somebody, and you were given like a budget, you were given a team. Where would you start? Like, what do you think is the end of the piece of string here in trying to sort of figure out a way back to the land?
I think we have to recoup and reset. And one of the things that I would do immediately is I would fund directly into local authorities to hire enough people to catch up with backlogs. So where EHCPs haven't had their annual reviews updated, where they haven't had EHCPs closed within the 20-week windows, I would overfund to make sure that we recouped and caught up. I would then reinvest in the NHS and in CAMS specifically, and give those mental health support services the support that they need to be able to do that. Incidentally, I don't think I would do much directly in school in terms of changing too much about what schools are expected to do or how they're expected to do it. I would review the Center Code of Practice is now 10, 11 years old. It was reviewed after 10 years previously, so we're now 2014/2015 to 2025. I'd review that kind of whole Center Code of Practice. But essentially, and the one that everyone will want me to say is provide more special school places. And that's needed. Some of the things that we misunderstand with special schools is not necessarily that we just need more spaces or places. We actually need schools in places, not we need places in schools. We need schools in places. So if you work in Oxford, which I have done, there's 3 or 4. If you work in Didcot, there's 0. And so you might think, well, it's only one stop on a train, but for a family, it could be 45, 50 minutes or an hour in a taxi. And so it's not as simple as that. So we need where a town or a city, well, city's probably not so much, but where a town has 3 or 4 or 5 schools, you're going to need a special school when all of those schools have around 1,000 kids in them.
Yeah. And it's not just special schools either, it's specialist provision.
Absolutely.
I've just been writing a piece about an organization that I had some links with, and I went down to visit them. They're based in the northeast of England. Spent a morning hearing about what they were doing, and then I spent the afternoon with one of the young people that they were working with. And this was a kid who'd been excluded from school. And given the severity of what he'd done and the publicity it attracted, there was probably no other choice but to put him out of that particular provision. But he then couldn't get in anywhere else. And I spent virtually 2 hours with him. And I know that's not the same as spending 2 hours with him in the company of 29 other kids, as you said earlier. But we had a really good conversation. He told me lots of things. He had lots to bring to the conversation. When we finished, he said it was an honor to meet me, and we shook hands and all of that. And he will be back in mainstream, I suspect, after the summer. And I think he may well cope with that. That wouldn't have happened without that additional input. And I think what you're saying is interesting, isn't it? That we need to increase the safety net by ensuring that pedagogy is open and appropriate. Benefits some, benefits all. I love that idea that you talk about. But we also need to put in some additional ropes that kids can be helped to walk along. It's that we've got a spectrum of need, so we need a spread of provision.
And we also need to just increase people's understanding of what needs are. So, for example, a lot of teachers won't know the difference between the terms neurodivergent, neurodiverse, and neurotypical. And one of the things that I've got in my new book that I'm writing is well, in fact, in this book itself, the back glossary is just a table of acronyms. And the amount of space that that's taken, just so that I could say to people, listen, here are all of the possible acronyms that I know of, and you can refer to them. But what I've gone further to do in my new book is to talk about what do these words mean? Where do they originate from? So we're using the right term. So, for example, people don't understand the distinction between saying a child with autism and an autistic child. So do we want to use person-centered language, or are we saying that this child is inflicted by autism, or actually autism is what they have and it's part of them and they're an autistic child? And so explaining the difference between the two is really important. But teachers don't know. It's the same with anti-racism. They'll say, I just don't know what to say or what not to say. And so it's like, well, you've got to learn them. You can't just sit there and say, I don't know. It's like the same way, the amount of examples that I push onto teachers is fascinating as to the similarities with what they would say in exactly the same terms to their students. So I'm like, how come, like for you, it's okay not to happen, but for your kids, you'd say, well, find out then, do your research, look it up, what you're doing. So it's the same for you guys. Like, what are we doing to enhance our knowledge in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. You were saying earlier about how this is not really a crisis because it's been a situation that's been sort of growing for many, many years. And you were just talking about special school places. I wonder, like, just what your thoughts are on, like, when I was training, I think we probably trained around the same time, like the mid 2000s. And the inclusion policy had sort of started to take root around about then, in sort of early to mid 2000s. To what extent do you think that policy has contributed to this situation now, and where do you stand on this sort of this question as to, like, the extent to which kids with SEND should be included in mainstream schools or should be educated in places that are better able to cater to their needs?
The irony is I don't even know what the inclusion policy is. I don't know who stipulated this or where this has come from. But in terms of, like, kind of which students should be taught where, I think if you've got a significant emotional or physical need that requires bespoke and additional adults at the same time, then a specialist provision is needed. A special school will be needed where children have attempted to learn and be taught in a mainstream environment with their peers, and it's not worked for no fault of their own, and therefore more specialist provision is needed. It's very complex in terms of, because a lot of specialist provision refuse, like I've had scenarios in schools that I've worked in where the local authority has agreed that specialist provision is appropriate, and the specialist provisions have turned around and said their needs are too high for us. And I've said, so what do I do in the meantime? Because if you can't manage it in a specialist provision, should I just carry on in a mainstream provision? Yes, that's who's named under the Section I of the HCP, so you must carry on. So we also need to understand that one of the things, one of the areas, sectors that's mostly forgotten, mostly underfunded, mostly mistreated is the specialist provision settings. So if we're going to improve specialist provision, we can't just increase the number of places and spaces. We need to invest in those schools. Who are the very best teachers? How are we getting in there? And the irony is about, I don't know, 7, 8, maybe 10 years ago, I would have gone into specialist teaching in special schools, but I was told categorically not to, because once you go in there, you can't then find your way out into a mainstream environment again. And that's a problem, because maybe there's a lot of really great people that are wanting to go in there, but are fearful of, is there security there? Is it, what am I going to be able to do?
Yeah, it's really interesting. When I took up my post as head of education in East Lothian in Scotland, we had no specialist provision at all because it was a disaggregated authority. And going back to your point, Amjad, the specialist provision happened to be in other places. And I opened a new specialist school. Very difficult, got lots of criticism because I was told it flew in the face of inclusion. But one of the things that we did that worked was we located it in the grounds of a primary school. And what that immediately meant was that we had effectively a joint campus. And that allowed for much more fluid movement, both of teachers, support staff, and young people between the schools. And it gave us that interesting level of flexibility that we wouldn't otherwise have had. And I often feel that we've missed a trick, because quite often what we do is when we create a special school, we put it somewhere where the one thing it won't affect is property values. So it's stuck somewhere really out of the way. And I really liked that halfway house in terms of inclusion. I liked that idea of the joint campus rather
Yeah,
than
and essentially that's what schools are doing now with having units within their own schools. Interestingly, one of the biggest special schools in Reading is a special school called Addington School, and that literally adjoined my secondary school. And when I started teaching, adjoined the field of my secondary school, the Bulmer School. And now, because the school's been around for 20 plus years now, the secondary school's connection with them is phenomenal. Like the PE students go and do their sports days, their connections between supporting with events and the swimming pools and everything is integrated. Yet they're two very separate schools, but yet they've accepted and joined in harmony. And you're on our doorstep, you're on our doorstep. How do we work together? And there's not enough of that. And there's not enough of secondary school teaching and learning leads going to special schools. They'll go to another secondary school similar to them and say, right, tell me about what your provision is and how you're doing this. I've seen you all over Twitter. You're amazing, but we're not going to special schools. I went and visited 2, 3 special schools in Oxfordshire when I first took up the post to learn from them. And it's something that is missing, I think, especially with our teaching and our practices.
Yeah, one of my mantras was making the margins mainstream. Because I think often what we do is we marginalize kids, but we need to make the margins mainstream. And actually, it's your idea, Amjad. I now know. It's about doing the things that are targeted for some but benefit all. And I still think there's huge mileage in that idea of this isn't something that we do for these kids. This is something that we do for all kids.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's why, I mean, I'll divulge my trick. My trick in CPD is to make everyone think it was their idea in the first place. And so when you make everybody, when I leave with everybody going, yeah, you know what? I knew that. I'm going to do that. I've got that. I already knew that. Then they don't leave thinking, how could I possibly do all this? And so by making them see clearly that this route is to change my habit, and the habit is based on a routine, and the routine is based on a cue, then we do that. And one of the things that I think we need to be clear and mindful about is a lot of people have written about CPD as a kind of process in schools, but we haven't given enough weight to people that are delivering the CPD, how to deliver. And I've seen David present many times, and every time I present, I text him, I say, David, give me some feedback. What can I do differently? How can I improve? Because it's an art and craft delivery. It's not you just got to know what it is. It's in your head. You've got to deliver it. And so something that we're looking at, especially in our trust and wider, is how do we know the people that know lots of stuff know how to deliver lots of stuff? And so that process is interesting. And I spoke to a very prominent speaker that David would know very well, and I won't say their name out loud. He said he paid £4,000 to go on basically an academy or public speaking academy to enrich his delivery. And I spoke to him for around 2.5 hours, and he said you covered everything in that 4 grand in those 2.5 hours for free. And I was like, yeah, maybe I should charge 4 grand for that. But the point wasn't about the money. The point was, are we teaching people how to present? And David, you know, because you've seen so many speakers and they don't land not because they don't know what they're saying or how they're saying it. They're not getting the emotional buy-in to make their attendees want to invest in change. And that's the point of any CPD, is to invest in change.
Mm. That's such an interesting point. I've never really thought about that. There is no training for like how to lead on CPD. They're a bit like this. Like I've never really seen training on how to chair meetings. Like so many people in education just go like, "What was the point of that meeting? That was just an absolute mess. One person talked for the whole hour."
There used to be something from, I can't fully remember the name, the National College of School Leadership, NCSL or something
Oh
like that.
yeah.
They used to do a middle leaders course, and I remember I did it like 2, 3 years into teaching. And it was literally one of the days was, how do you chair? How do you
All
write an
right.
agenda? How do you write minutes? How do you send the minutes out? Which I was like, this is groundbreaking. I was like, I don't know about any of this stuff. But they scrapped it as always. It just got scrapped, and I got a certificate, the National Middle Leaders Qualification. But I was able to be a middle leader as a result of it. Whereas we now promote people to CPD leads, but where from? Like, what we doing? Like, how? And so
Yeah.
it's thinking about that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, there's often an assumption that because teaching there's something that involves an element of public speaking, that teachers will just be good at that stuff automatically. But that's absolutely not the case. I do lots of work around oracy and public speaking, and I often get teachers to like write a little speech and present it to one another, and they're absolutely terrified, and their hands are shaking, and they're having that full like nervous system dysregulation response to just standing at the front of a room. And it's a very different not so much a skill set but a mindset. You just got to sort of, it's partly just getting used to being in that
But also to
situation.
parents, James, like at my previous school, I did a revision evening for parents. So, sitting down their year 11 child or the year 10 child and say, bring your mum and dad. Your mum and dad need to sit down with you. And I'm like, parents, you are now my students, listen. And like just being able to do that with parents, a lot of teachers, I mean, I make up a stat, I don't know the real stat, but I always make this stat up. I say around 90% of teachers are deeply introverted. Yet to be a public speaker, you could be a quiet introvert or an introverted extrovert, but I'm not suggesting all public speakers need to be like, ooh, look at me, but you need to have a particular way of presenting. And this is something that I think there's a gap here, absolutely, and we're addressing it within our trust and looking at it. And interestingly, the more work I'm getting now is delivering to senior leaders how to deliver. And some of them are CEOs and stuff, and you're like, you should know this, no? And it's just like, nope. And so at least they're acknowledging that they don't. But it's
Yeah.
and David, I don't know if you could share examples of where you've definitely seen that was needed.
Oh, sure. I mean, the number of times that I've been asked in to do sessions on handling difficult conversations,
Mhm.
and people are finding that increasingly challenging because I think generally people are more aggressive than they were. They're certainly more assertive than they were, and people just don't have any idea how to speak to their peers a lot of the time. And it,
Emotional intelligence is lacking in a lot of people, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah, and a lot of the time, I always remember. terrible story. But when I was a principal teacher, my very first parents' night as a principal teacher, all of my department were in the same room. And I had one teacher in the department who was he was a mature student, real down to earth guy. And a couple of parents came in and he said in a very strong Fife accent, he said, "And who you in to see me about?" And the parents gave the name of their child and he knocked on the desk and said, "See this desk? See your bairn? Wooden, the pair of them."
Wow.
And I wanted that swing low sweet chariot
Yeah.
to sweep down and pick me up. And to their enormous credit, the parent said, "I know he's no the brightest, but is there anything positive you can tell me about him?"
Absolutely,
You know,
absolutely. And but even situations like that, like there's this massive debate going around as to how procedural and how operational you make teaching and systems. But if you don't like, what we can't do is bemoan a lack of knowledge in any area unless you provide knowledge in that said area. So, for example, in schools that I work with, here's a script to use. Here's how you introduce yourself. Here's what you can say. Here's data that you could use. Here's the system and the process that you could use. And that then correlates all the way up to, say, senior leadership, where you're like, what's your line management process? How often do you meet? How do you take minutes? Where do you record the minutes? What's your agenda? But you can't bemoan them if they've never been shown how to do it. And if their only way of doing it is how it was done to them badly, then it's not their fault either. So, especially with Sen, this is the important thing. If I want something to be improved, then I've got to put in systems and processes to improve it. I can't just wish for it to be improved.
Yeah, yeah, I like it. Right, I would like to change gear a little now, if we may, and
Yeah.
I want to take you back to your own experience of school. And it's something that I often like to ask people about, like, where did you go to school? What kind of a student was the young Amjad? And then I've
Yeah.
got a follow-up question, but let's start with that.
Yeah. So I went to school in Reading, in Woodley. I went to a school called the Bulmer School. I went back and taught at my school then when I graduated. I was in bottom sets for everything right from year seven. I now know that we did a CATS test when I come in. I flunked that CATS test, and weirdly, in my primary school, I was one of two or three students, myself and my best friend Philip, who's still my best friend now. We would always get put out of the class, not for bad reasons, but to do extension tasks. So while the teacher was trying to teach some of the boys how to write a sentence and stuff, she'd say, "Here, read this, and then write a story on this." And we were given extra tasks. So I'd gone from like being at the top to like bam at the bottom. And I was with some of those kids that I was being separated from. And I was like, what's going on here? I thought, I just cracked on with it. Took me, I say, to the back end of year 10 to kind of work my way out of the bottom set classes.
Wow.
My parents, absolutely phenomenal people, couldn't help me one iota, but told me to work, study, study, study. I'm like, I'm struggling. I don't know what to do. Bless my three sisters. I've got three older sisters. My middle sister was academic. My younger sister was not academic. And my eldest sister was too far ahead of me to kind of figure out what she was doing or not. But they're all very successful in their own rights, working, etc. But school wasn't for them. So I was the first one to kind of get any form of good GCSEs and to study A levels, etc. But in terms of my school experience, I was just super sporty, James. I just played every sport. From like every school game, from football, cricket, rugby. I played rugby until it started to hurt in year 10, and I was like, forget this, this is nonsense. And yeah, just loved sport, loved that experience because we grew up, I wouldn't ever call my upbringing poor, but we were like that's how it was. So I couldn't afford to go to clubs or after school things or join a team or anything. So we did it all at school. When school offered it, we did it, we did it, we did it. And then loads of clubs picked you up from that. And we were essentially the pupil premium kids, so we got boots bought for us. And I remember one of the things that our council used to do, which was the best thing ever, was a passport to leisure card, which was called a D card. So parents who had children on free school meals used to get a D card, and we used to be able to go swimming for free. And so those days when public pools were open, every holidays we would be in the pool. But we used to get so badly judged, like the workers at the time you didn't hear it, but the workers used to be like, oh, it's the D card kids and D card kids are here and like da, 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 and like we didn't care. We were just like, okay, sir, like let us in. We want to go swimming. And so yeah, upbringing was cool. Stable family, lived in a house, terraced house in a terrace street. Went quite far. We used to cycle into school. But yeah, school experience was good. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it.
Really interesting. And then another thing that I'm very interested in is this idea of significant learning, right? This is an idea that was I first came across it, like talked about by Carl Rogers, the psychotherapist, and he talked about the inventor of counseling and just sort of like person-centered counseling, where he was sort of like, if you create the right conditions, then people will just sort of figure out their problems themselves. I'm not here to tell them how to live their life, but you give them like unconditional positive support, positive regard, rather, be congruent, be honest, be true in the moment, and so on, and they will sort of self-actualize. And he once gave this really interesting speech where he sort of said, I'm not interested in like inconsequential learning that you can just learn from reading a book. I'm really interested in the learning that shapes people's lives. And I often ask people about this, and it's really interesting because it often is not the stuff that happens in formal educational settings. It's often sort of a person you met randomly, a book you found on a bus or something. So I just wonder if, without having given you any preparation to think about this, I wonder if there are any sort of key moments that have shaped you, like moments of significant learning that could be within your career in education or something completely different.
I mean, the first time I realized that there is a stark divide of classes was when I went to university. I didn't realize it existed, to be honest, because you're always around your own people, you're always around. And I was interested because I had, our school was, it would be called diverse, right? It was diverse and inclusive, but it was segregated. You had the black kids, the Asian and black kids, the white kids, and then the sporty kids. The sporty kids was a bit of everyone, because if you were sporty, you just mix with everyone. So I was with everyone and had my own groups, etc. But you didn't realize that some families lived in a different way until you got invited to parties or invited to a disco or something like that. But invariably, we didn't go to those things. Coming from a Muslim background, we didn't go to a park to drink in the evening. And so the older we got kind of marginalized more from those groups, and we moved more into our sports groups. But when I got to university, I didn't realize that there was a whole different world out there, like in terms of elitism and in terms of upbringing and private school education and all of those. And one of the things that I would say the consequential learning element that come about was my initial reaction to all of them was toffs and like posh and all of that. But actually spending time with those people, I was like, you know what? People are people. It's okay. You didn't get a choice that you went to private school. So that doesn't mean that I should treat you any differently because you were fortunate or unfortunate enough to do that. But one thing I did note is there was more of a sense of frustration from people like me who wanted to have that life than the other way around. Those people wanted to throw that life away, which I found weird. Like, I don't even want that. I don't even want to go on 3 holidays a year. And I'm like, you lot are mad. Why not? Like, why wouldn't you want to do those things? So that was interesting. And having gone to university in Oxford, Brookes and Oxford, is the amount of diversity, unbelievable. Like my best friend at university was, and I've never met anyone with this kind of mix since, half Ukrainian, half Jamaican. My other best friend and housemate was half Irish, half Iranian. And so, when we were all there, and I was like, you're from where? And you're from what? And I was like, how does this work? I was like, I need to go around your house. And one of his flatmates was from a remote part of Devon. And I promise you, when she come into the house once, I was sat there. Adrian, the half Jamaican, half Ukrainian, was sat there. Nav, the half Irish, half Iranian, was sat there. And she just looked petrified. And we were like, what's the matter? Like, and she was like, look, I don't mean to be funny, but I've never met you lot. And I was like, what do you mean? She was like, no, you don't understand. My school, my area, my sixth form, my college, the pubs, like they don't exist. Like you lot aren't there. And we were like, you're stupid. What are you talking about? And we went and spent a weekend in her house, and she was right. We weren't there. But it was fascinating because your immediate response is that they're going to be problematic with you or have an issue with you, but they were like, welcome, who are you guys? Like, come and talk to us. And so that was very consequential, like in terms of understanding that people's misunderstanding isn't always coming from a bad place.
Yeah, right. Right. Super
Um,
interesting.
Amjad, I'm gonna take you off in a different direction, and we've got a standing joke in this podcast, which is about the book Unfinished Business,
Yeah,
which you contributed a chapter
yep,
to.
yep.
James thinks I am the unending advert rather than the unfinished business. So it was a book that kind of commemorated, celebrated Tim Brighouse, and
Mm,
also pointed towards the unfinished business and how we might take it up. And you were one of the contributors to that. So it would be really interesting to know, first of all, why you were involved in it, what your chapter was about, and for sure your chapter has one of the great titles because it's something about tearing down hedges.
mm.
So tell us a bit about all of that. Why were you in it? What was your chapter about?
Yeah, I mean, I don't sell this enough, and I use the word selling intentionally. I don't tell people enough how lucky I've been. Not only have I had the mentorship of yourself, I had the mentorship of Sir Tim Brighouse. So I actually worked in a school where he was a governor, and so he saw me speak at a teach meet, and he advised the then head, "You need to give someone like this a job." And so he made me apply for a job. And I thought it's a given, right, James? I just turned up for the interview thinking, yeah, it's all good. Like this guy's like hooking me up. It were 8 people for the interview, and I was like, what? This is a proper interview. And he said, listen, Amjad, I'm glad you're here, but I can't get involved because that'd be a conflict of interest. So good luck. And I was like, oh. And so I did it. I got the job off my own back. And so then he mentored me, and I'm very fortunate to do that and have that kind of involvement. And he taught me a lot of things. And at the time, I was writing a blog, New to the Post, and I've kept my blog called New to the Post because I feel like we're always still new to the post, no matter how long we've worked at there. And I wrote every time I met him, I wrote about kind of the things that he taught me and the things that he done. And one of the big memories that I have is always of David and Tim being at events for Hayes and Birmingham events and teach meets. And every time I saw him, he would like metaphorically grab me by the scruff of my neck and be like, listen. And I'm like, I'm listening. Like, talk to me. Tell me, what is it that I need to listen to? And so then you'd have David saying, listen, and him. And I'm like, ah. And I'm like learning. But one of the things that I'll never forget as well, we went to, and this is interestingly, David, this has come full circle. I'm now going back to this event 15 years on or something. Whole Education put on an event, and Ron Berger or Berger, however you pronounce it, and John Hattie and Tim Brighouse were speaking. And I went with a bunch of our kids because we were presenting. I did something with the kids and they presented on the stage. And at lunchtime, he called me over. He was like, you're going to sit with us. So I was sitting with Ron, John, Tim, and me. And I was just going, I don't know what I'm meant to be saying in this situation, how I'm meant to be talking in this situation. And now there's an event, Whole Education again, and Ron, John, and I'm presenting. So it's fascinating how his input has been there. And I was delighted to be asked to write a small section of his chapter. But you see, interestingly, that's also one of the books that I keep here. The rest of the books are in my library, in my office. The amount of people, the book is this thick. That's how many people can write about Tim and how many people can explain the life of him. And he's easily one of the people that if you say, Tim Brighouse, yeah, of course, I had this or I did this and that, and I'm like, yeah, but he took me out for pizza and stuff. Did you know? So yeah, that is amazing. And like yourself, like David, I've stayed in your house. I've eaten your lovely wife's dinners. So yeah, that's one of the things that I would say is really, really important. And also, James, linking back to what you said earlier, consequential learning. Like I've made it my job. And in Islam, interestingly, it says surround yourself with people whose knowledge you want to gain. And so I attempted to do that a lot. And despite being very early in my career, I knew about Satin Bragas, and I'm like, listen, tell me stuff, teach me stuff. And he did. And it was really fascinating.
So which edges should we be tearing down, Amjad?
I mean, he was all about inclusion, wasn't he? He was all about equity and he was all about that. And interestingly, it was his phrase that I borrowed. And it was his phrase that I heard for the first time, the low effort, high impact stuff. And so that was back in the day. You know, when everybody hears a phrase, but nobody knows who it's attributed to. That's his.
Yeah.
He said that. He said, Amjad, you need to look at low effort, high impact stuff, not quick wins, not gimmicks. But I said, listen, people just see it as a gimmick and they just see me. Because I've also been a bit of a businessman alongside what I've been doing, and like what people would say to me all the time, oh, you're on Twitter all the time. I'm like, Twitter's marketing, Twitter's my advertising, like Twitter's business. Like you've got to be on there to be able to be noticed. And he said, don't worry about them because the ones that you want to notice aren't the ones moaning about you tweeting. So don't worry about them. And he would always teach me to ignore that. But the tearing the hedges down, the idea of you don't need to worry about the people that are causing those issues for you. Tear the hedges down for the kids so everyone can see through. It's really, really powerful what he taught me.
Brilliant. Really grateful for that, Amjad. That's why you're in the book.
Yeah, I mean, it is like, just to have that, I would say that's easily one of my biggest achievements in education is to have someone as successful as him to be recognized as playing a small part in his life. So yeah, really important.
Amazing. I've got Brighouse envy from both of you. I was fortunate enough to meet him 2 or 3 times in the last years of his life, and they were beautiful conversations that we had. But yeah, I didn't get to go for pizza with him. So
No. He ordered mine as well. He said he'll have. I was like, okay, I'll eat them. Yeah.
So I've got 3 questions to wrap up with, and essentially, so they're positives, like one of each: positive, challenge, and solution. So something first of all that's really good that you like the look of, and this we could circle back to SEND, could be about representation stuff, anti-racism, wherever you want to land with this. Then the next question is, what do you think is the major challenge or a major challenge that you think is probably not getting the airtime that it needs currently? And the last one is like, what would be your fix to that challenge?
Okay, so positive is technology has made the world more accessible and smaller, and therefore we can tie in and get involved in far more than we would have done. For example, like when else would we have been able to have a conversation with the 3 of us all sitting in different locations? But not only that, invite other people into this world as well, driving to work or listening on their headphones or watching on their screens. I think technology has played a massive part. I know people are skeptical about AI, but I think AI is going to be phenomenal and is going to be huge. When used appropriately. But it's a bit like I would say to my students back in the day, you can't just shout at Google to tell you the answer. You've got to ask the question. So AI is exactly the same way. Like, what are you doing? What's the input? I think for me, a big challenge is I feel, and I don't know if David's felt this as well, I feel as lots of people are now recognizing that they need further and enhanced training on, say, adaptive teaching, but they're feeling the pinch so much that they can't, and then they'll start to see it as a bigger and bigger problem. So they'll get in touch with me and say, can you do this for this amount or this for this many days? And I say, whilst I would love to, I can't. This is what we're doing. And so I think that that's going to be a challenge. A lot of schools will simply move to that really closed mindset of we only provide CPD internally. And it's like, well, have you got the best possible people to do that internally before you say it's as simple as that? And the solution would be to train your own, to build your own, to make sure that your own can do what you want them to do, and also not be blinkered in the sense of, oh, we need some CPD on XYZ, so therefore, James, you're the best possible person. Why? Just because I've got the closest title in my role to do with it, it doesn't mean that I'm the best possible person. So understanding what that is and how that works. And also understanding the difference between a lecture, a keynote, and a workshop. They all need different things. And David and I have delivered and on both of those, the way you present all three of them, sorry, the way you present all three is very different. Whereas I've seen people deliver the same for all three. And so that's a challenge and that's a solution to understand the distinction between the three. We the orators in the UK are very fixed. So you get people like we look to our politicians as our best orators. In America, you look to the more inspirational, happy, clappy people. Whereas actually, there's far more people that we need to broaden out. Who is a good orator and how does that work?
Yeah, really interesting. I haven't really come across that one before. I'm going to go away and reflect a lot on that. The idea of like so much of what we talk about, like this work that I do with Oracy Cambridge, is focused on kids, and we do a bit of work around oracy among teachers. But it's more about just sort of, again, there's an assumption there that teachers know how to speak and listen effectively, and that things like dialogic approaches to teaching and to CPD, things like lesson study, for example, are the way to go. But I'm going to go away and think some more about that. That's a really interesting point, and nobody's raised it before. So thank you for that.
No problem. I mean, it's something that I've been thinking hard about for a little while, hence why I've developed a program on it. And there's a lot of people, and David will get this as well, and I'm sure you do as well. After you deliver a talk, will come up to you and say, "I want to do that," and it's not as simple as just saying, "Yeah, okay, cool, just do it then." It's like how do we get to the position we're getting to? And I've said to David, and David's always very honest with me, the development of my speaking journey over the years. And I've said that, how can I improve and how can you do that? Because the moment a teacher stops learning is the moment your students will stop learning. So we need to remind our teachers of that as well. If you think that you've done what you've always done and you'll carry on doing what you've always been doing, then there's going to be a problem.
Right. My head used to always say that if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always got. It's very true. Yeah.
But now it's not even as simple as that. If you've always done what you've always done, now you're going to get worse than you got.
Why do you say that?
Because children and systems and processes are different now. So I wouldn't teach how I taught previously, despite my kids doing really well. I still wouldn't teach that in that way now. Because I think the way that we understand learning, the science of learning, the kind of the almost destruction of children's attention spans with quick switching video clips and fast moving systems, it's different now. So I think if we've always do what we've always done, I think it'll be worse now.
Right.
Brilliant. And I think that's yet another talking point that we could come back to and revisit, but I'm really conscious of our time. And one of the things that we should point out is that we'll put links into your book, Amjad, and how to get hold of that. And obviously we'll be renewing, restoring and reinvigorating the links to unfinished business with
absolutely.
a particular emphasis in your chapter. But yeah, thank you so much for today. That's been real high energy contribution and much appreciated.
No, thank you so much. I enjoy talking with really clever people about things like this. So it's one of those things that, when I first started teaching, I promise you, there is not a chance in the world that I would sit and listen to other teachers talk about teaching. I'd be like, listen, I've had enough of it. I'm not doing it. And then when I realized that there's gaps, my wife, for example, was saying to me, how do you know about stuff? Because I listen, watch, read, and learn. And it's like, that's how we find out, isn't it? So giving everyone the opportunity, I hope people have found it useful. And yeah, thank you so much for doing this as well, for you bringing in lots of guests and doing this.
Yeah, super interesting. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure. Take care.
How it is and how it should be, wrestling in the streets again. One's got the other by its expectations. The other is going for a submission. Hope has stoicism by the neck. Acceptance is struggle. struggling for breath. 'Cause driving has it on the ropes. What I want is being choked. My wheels being dragged through a hedge backwards. Not before it bloodied the nose of the world. Happy as it boxed the years of change. Contented, assaulted, progress with a chain. May you find kindness under that stone. May the fall come early this year. That bridge should be finished this year. You can go